Well, hello and welcome to the latest professional pensions webinar looking at protecting pensions in the times of crisis, a discussion we're holding in association with Wealth at Work. My name's Jonathan Stapleton, editor of PP, and I'm going to be your host for this discussion. As financial pressure on household incomes continues, it's more important than ever that people are engaged with their finances, and this includes with their pensions. This webinar will share latest research and insights into how cost of living worries are impacting pension savings and discuss how employers and trustees best respond and support members at these difficult times. Talk us through these issues, I'm delighted to welcome Jonathan Watsley, Director at Wealth at Work, and Kevin Wesbroom, Professional Trustee at Capital Cranfield. Just a quick reminder, this is an interactive session, so if you have a question to put to our panel, please type it in the Ask Question box on your screen. I'll ask as many of those during the webinar as I can. Well, before we begin, can I ask Jonathan and Kevin to tell us a little bit more about who you are and what it is you do, please. Kevin, can I start with you?
Yeah, hi, afternoon everybody. Kevin Wesbroom, Capital Cranfield. I'm a professional trustee on a range of DB and DC schemes.
Thank you very much indeed. Jonathan.
Yeah, good afternoon everyone. Jonathan Watsley. I'm a director at Wealth at Work, and we specialise in going into employers and helping employees and scheme members to understand their pensions and their finances hopefully a little better.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Jonathan, can I come to you to sort of begin our discussion today and set out the background, please? Wealth at Work has, I understand, just conducted some research on the impact of rising costs on pension savings. What were the findings of those, please?
Yeah, so we conducted research in April, and there were about 2,000 people that responded to it, and some of those findings were quite surprising, I think, in terms of some of the percentages. So I thought it'd be quite good to share those with people on this call. So if I just run through a few of them. So 83% of respondents said that they thought that the cost of living crisis would mean that they would have to work a lot longer than they had originally planned for. We had 59% of people that said that they were thinking of either stopping pension contributions altogether or indeed reducing them somewhat to what they were paying currently. We had another 31% of people that said that they would consider withdrawing pension early. So basically, once they got to age 55, nearly a third of people saying that they would potentially withdraw money from that pension while still working. And then we had a third who thought they would never be able to retire. And we had another third, in round numbers, who said that they didn't feel that their employers were supporting them in decisions and their saving decisions around pensions.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Jonathan. If I can come to you, Kevin, the research showed that, you know, as Jonathan said, while only a small proportion of people have actually reduced or halted contributions so far, nearly 60% are considering doing so in the future. Does that and these findings generally surprise you? Do you think, more importantly, people realise what it is they're actually giving up when they reduce or stop contributions, as terms of not only the employer contributions and the tax relief, but also the impact on their retirement income as well?
I was very pleased to that Jonathan's survey confirmed that relatively few people so far have reduced pensions or stopped pensions. I suspect we might be facing that 61% or whatever it was that say they're thinking about it. I suspect when their fixed rate mortgages come to an end, we may find there's a lot more pressure on people to think about it. You know, you asked the question, do they realise what they're giving up? Well, given the level of general knowledge about pensions, it's fair to say a fair proportion of them won't, although I suspect they will be reminded of it. I suspect in some cases it doesn't almost matter what you're giving up. It's a question for individuals of balancing short-term and long-term financing. There's no point in having a great pension pot if you've just been thrown out of your house for failure to meet your mortgage payments. You know, so I think what the crisis does bring out is this pressure between short term and long term. Or put it another way, you know, I'll answer your question another way. What's the cost of borrowing money from my pension? Yeah, it's quite high when you work out the loss of employer contributions, the tax relief and so forth. Is that more or less than it's going to cost me to borrow from Wonga or whoever's left doing Wonga's business nowadays? So, you know, I think my point would always be that we have to put this in the context of the real challenges that individuals face. I think quite often from pensions, we tend to assume pensions is the only thing that matters. And actually, I think what the crisis does is it forces you to think about people in terms of their whole needs.
Jonathan, Kevin mentioned people coming off fixed rates for their mortgages, and we've got a question in here from one of our audience. Do you foresee that people with big rise in their mortgage rates will be most likely to stop or reduce contributions? Is that what your research and your work showing you?
Yeah, I think, well, we're all waiting to see what the impact of that will be, but we know that some of the increases are going to be quite shocking, and so individuals are going to have to look at what areas they may be able to cut back, and of course cutting back on areas where there is significant saving, if you like, in order that they can meet those repayments. So pension would most probably fall into that category as a way to realise some extra cash each month. But in addition to that, one of the things that we've already started talking to employees and scheme members about is also looking at some of their other costs that are relatively high. So typically these are things like insurances, so household insurance, buildings contents insurance, car insurance, broadband contracts, mobile contracts. All of those sorts of things, if you count them up over a year, tend to be relatively expensive items. And yet we know that if people shopped around, they could often get much better deals and save hundreds and hundreds of pounds over the year. So there is a broader debate here about how people manage, if you like, their income and their outgoings when we know things are going to get tougher, and then what are the priorities. So in other words, clearly it might be better that you go and save some money by renegotiating your broadband and your insurances, or certainly at renewal, versus having your first priority as I'm just going to cut or reduce my pension contributions. So there's a lot of work and discussion going on at the moment in the employers that we work for and the schemes that we work for around that broader context.
Thanks, Jonathan. Is that sort of, do you think financial education is sort of the answer to help sort of some of these people before they necessarily dig into their pension?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the interesting things around this, I think, is that some of the things that we end up discussing almost seem like really obvious things, but I think that often people are, well, they just don't think of them. And I think one of the problems of the past is that when we've had issues like this before, because I mean we have had times, the context has been slightly different, but we have had hard times before. You know, we think about the financial crisis back in 2008. I remember very similar discussions then. Clearly we had COVID, and now we've got the cost of living crisis and the impact of that on the impact of inflation and therefore interest rates and the knock-on effect to mortgages. So we have been around this before, and I think that some of the things that haven't worked in the past. So, for example, when you try to explain to people things that they need to give up in order to pay the bills, people are less reluctant to listen. Whereas if you actually describe to them better ways of managing their money and perhaps not giving up without the need to give up so much, people are more open to those sorts of ideas. And as I say, some of those ideas are pretty straightforward. It's just that people don't think about them. So it is important to have those interventions, those educational interventions in whatever form they may take, to help individuals with that.
Thanks so much, Kevin. What's your thoughts on this? And what do the schemes you act for and their sponsoring employers typically provide in terms of financial education and support? And is this beginning to change?
Yeah, it's certainly a changing environment. At the risk of stating an obvious one, there's quite a big difference between a DB scheme or a DC scheme. DB schemes do tend, probably rightly, to think of pensions as being their sole purpose. I think the leading DC schemes and certainly some of the leading master trusts are much better at putting pensions in the total context of an individual's finances. So, the good little online modelers about what happens if I increase or reduce my pension contributions won't just look at that. They'll consider other aspects of the finances along the lines that Jonathan was saying. Are there other areas you can make savings or whatever? So I think the marketplace is changing, and I think the vanguard of it is with those, probably with the big master trusts, which is probably just as well because they're the people that reach out. The big A auto-enrolled generation of people who tend to be less well served. I suspect, Jonathan, you probably had more clients in with the larger balances, larger amounts, and that sort of thing. It's those auto-enrolled generations who are probably the ones feeling the pinch most, who could do with that support and education. And I think it's getting there, but we've still got plenty of work to do.
Thank you, Kevin. Jonathan, coming back to you, when you if you're an employer or a scheme, how is this sort of support, financial education or guidance best provided, and indeed, what's the best time to provide this support?
Yeah, so I think again, part of this is contextualization, really. So when people are earlier in their career, so younger, then often discussions around pensions are often put in broader discussions around managing finance and the monthly budget, as it were, and things that people can do, the hints and tips to make their money go further. Whereas as people get older, then it starts becoming more specific. So by the time you've got to kind of mid-career, often we will do sessions, and they're often online seminars where we're getting people to think about what's in their pension pot or pension pots, because of course a lot of people will have more than one. And are they on track? If they've sort of notionally done 20 years in work, but they've got another 20 years to go, then are they on track for the sort of retirement that they would hope for, and at a time when they would hope to retire? And if they're not, then clearly they got 20 years, give or take, to try and rectify that situation. And then as you get closer to retirement, it becomes more specific again, because you're looking at glide paths and how people may want to take their income in retirement. Quite interestingly, I saw a report last week from the Institute of Fiscal Studies that was raising this very point about a large percentage of people who don't understand how they're going to take money from their DC pot. So in other words, they don't understand the options. They don't understand generically what are the pluses and the minuses of those various options. So all of that needs to start happening, I would say, probably by the time you're 50. And then, of course, when you're on the edge of making that retirement decision, then you need another intervention again, because even though you might be following a glide path, even though you might have planned throughout, although I have to say most people don't, but even if you had, then you still need to make the right decisions for where you are at that point in time as you retire. And of course, as we all know, regulations change constantly. So even what you thought was a good thing 10 years ago may not now be a good thing, because the regulatory environment has changed. So I think there is definitely a kind of age thing that dictates the context of what's being discussed. And I think the other thing is also how people get help and support. So we run we always call it the inverted pyramid, and it doesn't have to work like this, but it's probably a good way to think about it. Is that if you think about any of those interventions, so let's take the people that are about to retire as an example, that in the ideal world, you would want 100% of people that are at that point to understand what their options are. So the way that intervention may happen is let's say through a seminar where their current scheme's described. It picks up other scheme types that they may have. It will cover issues such as taxation and the options that are generically available to them. But then, so ideally, you'd have 100% of people understanding that. And then as a result of that, there would be a subset who would say, great, that was really, really helpful, but I really want to talk to somebody because I've got some specifics about my situation that, again, I'd like to understand the context of. So they might want a guidance call, which could be, well, could be online, could be on the telephone, could even be face-to-face, but it's not regulated advice. And then there'd be a subset of that group that potentially would say, well, actually, I think I do need regulated advice because I've got some more complex situation where I really need somebody to tell me what to do and how to do it. And so if you imagine that inverted pyramid, in any of those groupings that I mentioned earlier, it almost goes from the 100% and then a subset of that as you go down that pyramid.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. We're having comments and questions coming in. One comment here from one of our viewers today. I've spoken to lots of individuals over the last 12 months about the cost of living crisis. It's incredible how many had not sat down and been through a simple budgeting exercise to review their income and outgoings. Jonathan, are you often surprised by that too?
Yeah, I mean, because I think if you work in this industry, if you work in the finance industry, I think it's very easy to think, well, why doesn't everybody understand this? And we kind of forget that generally people don't understand it. Most people generally are quite poor at managing finances, and often they don't quite know what they're getting into. Often when they're buying financial products, which is why we have the problem with people buying into debt and loans at high interest rates, because they don't really understand how it operates and the compounding effect and all the rest of it. So yeah, for a lot of these groups, and again, this is where not exclusively, but at the younger age, we would do a lot of work discussing more, if you like, general and broader finances. So there's almost a base understanding of some of the things that people should be aware of. And as I say, then it can drill down and become more specific as they get older. But absolutely right, yeah, we see it all the time.
Thanks, Jonathan. Kevin, you're sort of nodding there. You sort of, is it sort of your experience too?
Yeah, and I very much go along with that we sometimes overlook the basics. Strangely enough, I asked that nice Mr. ChatGPT what the answer to this problem was. I put the questions that we're talking of into GPT, and it wrote me a nice page and a half of answers. What is its first point was communication and transparency, but the second one, financial education and guidance. Employers and trustees can offer information and help on budgeting, managing debt. They almost seem obvious stuff to us, but for a large part of the population covered by pensions, it can be really helpful if trustees and employers can help deliver that information. And that's almost almost across the board type information. I agree with Jonathan. A lot of the interactions and communications we have with people do need to be segmented and targeted. And a blanket message is really going to miss. I take your point about that spending decisions at retirement are complicated. Yeah, absolutely right. There's no point trying to engage a 20-year-old in that conversation because it's just not relevant to them for another 30, 40 years. So yeah, you'd have that conversation with the older people. I'm a bit of a fan of the midlife MOT because I think, as Jonathan was saying, there's a sweet spot at which stage people are just starting to get engaged in this because it's not too far away, but they're not so far away that they can't do something. They're not so close, rather, to retirement that they can do something about it. So, I think there's a whole series of issues around when do we engage, how do we engage, and what messages are we trying to get. I see we've had one question in the online questions about engaging with younger members, which I find fascinating. Based on my experience, one of the most things they're engaged about is investment aspects. What are we doing with their money? Which is slightly ironic because they're the people who have got so little relatively invested in pensions, but they are very engaged, very interested in what we're doing with their money, investing it for the future. Are we destroying the planet so that there won't be anywhere left for them to retire to? So there's a lot of questions about the style and the frequency and the method of engagement, which I think we can take on board.
Thank you, Kevin. Jonathan, just to pick up on that question that Kevin alluded to, our listener said, what advice would you give about engaging with those younger members in the mid-20s to mid-30s? They find it quite difficult to communicate with this group. You talked about sort of taking that high-level view to sort of doing the sort of high-level budgeting and so forth, financial education. Is there anything you can add to that at all for that younger group?
Yeah. So whilst that broader piece is important in terms of what's delivered, of course, that's not a very exciting carrot to dangle to someone to get them engaged in the first place. So it's really important that in any of this communication, it's the classic question of what's in it for me. Why am I gonna care about this? And of course, that's why with older groups, we certainly when they get sort of 50 plus, you mention retirement, and you would almost got to only mention that word, and you'll get them engaged because they believe there's something in it for them that they need to know. So of course that has to be interpreted for all the other age groups as well. So right now, because of cost of living, some of the things that the carrots that we're dangling are often related back to the benefit platform that the employer's offering. So, for example, if the classic one we see is where employers will offer discounts at high street retailers, discounts off your weekly shop, and yet the take-up of these benefits are often woefully low. Whereas if you go out with a communication, say, hey, sign up to a seminar next week, we're going to show you how you're going to get X% off your weekly shop, or if there's a special going where there's 30% off a new laptop from PC World or whatever. We just dangle a couple of those carrots because it's just enough for people to go, oh, that sounds quite interesting. And then actually what we end up talking about is relevant to that, but it's also a broader discussion, but it's a way to get them in. And I think this is the other point I would make, is that this is the old debate around people use the word engagement, but then they use very passive communication, which is almost a kind of an oxymoron in that, if you just have flat web copy or worse still, you're just producing a leaflet or something, it's very, very difficult to get that engagement because it's a very passive way of communicating. So you've got to make it much more active.
Thanks, Jonathan. Kevin, I mean, we've talked about financial education guidance and engaging members for quite a long time, but employers and trustee boards have typically been quite reluctant to put a sort of formal program of education and sort of in place. What do you think's inhibiting employers and trustees from doing more in this space, and what do you think might be done to break down some of those barriers and possibly concerns that they have?
Yeah, I think if you take it back far enough, there was always the fear that they'd be breaching the dreaded the difference between guidance and advice, and that they get hauled off to jail for giving advice to people. My own view is that's a little bit less of an inhibition nowadays, because I think the quality of educational material, clearly not advice from people like Jonathan and so forth, I think the volume and the quantity of that that's available now means that you can do a lot more if you want. I think we've seen some other good changes that I think are very supportive. I call out the fact that a lot of schemes now offer a range of contribution options, which is really powerful. So if we're right, and when people come to renew their mortgages, a lot of them are going to be thinking, well, shall I opt out of pension? If there's an opportunity to pay lower contributions but still remain in the pension, I think that's a great opportunity. And even though it's not a trustee thing, it's something as a trustee, you'd always be pushing the employer to see if there is flexibility so that people can keep the retirement savings habit, albeit at a lower level, to reflect their current needs. And I think generally as an industry, we've done quite a good job there. What else is inhibiting it? A couple of things: budget and bandwidth. To do this well, and Jonathan gave you a flavour of some of the things. Not just putting some blank copy on an internet site, but one-to-one support and the whole range of things, retirement seminars, all of those. Potentially that does start to increase the cost when all schemes are under cost pressure of one sort or another. The other is bandwidth as well. Is this top of the list of problems that pension funds are facing? They seem to have enough problems on the investment side, coping with the LDI fallout, coping with the fact that everybody seems to know how I should invest my money in a DC scheme. Everybody's got their ideas. I'm having to cope with, as it's always been at that one level, but there's no shortage of things in front of trustees and employers to think about on pensions. And the brutal point is, has this got far enough up the list that it's going to get the time and energy from those parties?
Jonathan, budget and bandwidth, is that sort of a common hurdle that sort of seems to be out there for employers and trustee boards when considering doing more on this?
Yeah, I guess, well, on the positive side, I think one of the things that is very encouraging is that we are having increasingly more relationships with both the employer and the scheme working in tandem, and I think that's really helpful in the sense that in terms of the budget, they can decide between themselves as to exactly how that's financed. But the fact that both those parties are engaged is very helpful, and clearly in terms of direction of travel, they both believe that in ensuring people understanding their pensions and indeed that broader context is really important. So I think the good news is more of that is happening. I guess the bit that's the concern is that we've still got a long way to go. So if you look at we've done research on this in the past, but other organisations have, and I think I'll be right in saying that if you look at the number of organisations and schemes that run structured financial education with guidance, with a regulated advice provider where they've done due diligence and all the rest of it, then the education is probably running at 30% or so of organisations, and then the advice bit is running probably at about 25%, which is an increase to where it was. I mean, some of this is tracked year on year, so it is an increase on where it was. But clearly, let's say it's you're aggregating at about 30%. Clearly, there's still a long way to go.
Thanks so much. Bring in some more of our questions. A question here about sort of benefits generally. For some people, pension savings could deprive them of potential pension credits and be counterproductive. Jonathan, if I can broaden that one out, do you get a lot of questions with regards to the interaction of benefits when you're doing all these sort of things and how that might impact things?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up. I mean, certainly in some of the organisations we work for, where there's a profile of the workforce where there's a lot of, if you like, lower paid people, so people that are less likely to have much in terms of previous pension pots that they've built up, but then of course they're the people that are going to be suffering the most probably right now through cost of living, because we know that we see the overall inflation figures, but when you break those down into food costs and energy costs, which of course the lower paid pay a much higher proportion of their earnings to, then it does become an interesting debate, because what you don't really want to do is, despite what we were saying earlier, is you don't want to encourage those people to sacrifice, and Kevin mentioned this really, sacrifice so much today in order that they get a bit of pension at some point in the future when they retire, and then when they get to that point they realize that bit of pension has now, for example, stopped them getting housing benefit, because we know one of the trends in the economy generally is that there's more people that will be renting as they go into retirement. So clearly rents will most likely to continue to rise, and so therefore housing benefit would be something that a lot of those people potentially would be looking at. So it is a tricky one, because of course the other problem with it is that no one's got a crystal ball, so you can only talk about it as the situation is today. But of course, if someone's not retiring for 15 years or 20 years or whatever, then of course the benefit regime could be completely different by then. So it is a tricky one, but I think again it goes back to that educational bit, that it's important that people understand that there are trades-offs in this, and there will potentially always be trade-offs in this. And I think that's one of the overarching points I'd make, really, not just for the group that may be claiming benefits, but actually people generally when they're coming up to retirement, is that I think there's too much out there, which is, if you like, probably provider specific, which kind of convinces people, oh, this is much better for you than this other option over here. Whereas the truth of the matter is there's a number of options, and all of those options have upsides and downsides. And the trick is working out what might be best for you, given your personal circumstance.
Thank you. Kevin, any thoughts on that yourself?
Yeah, just I was almost going back to the days when, people weren't paying into pensions because it was going to affect their means tested state pension, and thinking, we've got rid of that one. We've solved that one. Thank you, Gordon Brown. But Jonathan then takes us straight back into the fact it is still there and still a very much a live issue because of things like housing benefit and rental costs, which actually are still interacting with pensions in adverse ways. From the point of view of trying to communicate that with members, I think this is now an even more complicated area, trying to talk to people about interaction with future means tested benefits. That feels like an area where I think a lot of trustees and probably employers really wouldn't want to go. No problem, they can lay it off to somebody like Jonathan, and I'm sure he can deal with it. But it just feels like another really dangerous area where you could end up inadvertently giving people wrong guidance.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much indeed. Brings us on to another topic here with regards to debt, Jonathan. Our questioner says that, is there a big risk that people are in debt due to the cost of living crisis, and then accessing the pension to perhaps address their debt, either through reducing or phasing out contributions, or indeed access if they're of the age to do so. Should trustees be signposting to other organisations that could perhaps assist with alternative debt management solutions, possibly address sort of the root cause of things like that? How do you find out if people have those sort of more persistent issues?
Yeah, so I mean, this is quite an interesting area. In fact, there's been quite a lot of debate about this, actually, in the context of mortgage rates going up as well, because I guess there's a spectrum here of debt, isn't there? There's if you like, what we would always term good debt, in the sense that having mortgage debt isn't particularly a problem, because it's clearly a good way to purchase a house, unless you're lucky enough to be able to just write a check and buy one. But of course, most people are not. That's good debt in the sense that, you know, okay, you need to shop around and all the rest of it to get the best rate, but you know, it's not like a credit card or a payday loan where the interest rates are potentially through the roof. So on one hand, you've got that at one end of the spectrum, you've got that good debt. But even with that, with interest rates rising, and as Kevin said earlier about the fixed rate contracts coming up for renewal, then there is this debate about, well, actually, even if you had spare money, would you be better off paying off some of your mortgage rather than, for example, putting it into your pension, because actually that trade-off is financially better for you. So you've got it at the, if you like, the good debt end of the spectrum, but then of course you've got what we call the bad debt end of the spectrum, which is where you are into credit card debt and loans with high fees. So with that type of thing, then if it's effectively out of control, then sure, they should be referred. So there's organisations like the National Debt Line, for example, which is a charity which can really help people. You know, if they're in real financial dire straits, and you know the bailiffs are about to knock on at the door, as it were. But also you've got, you know, there's something in between those two as well, in terms of, again, this goes back to the education thing. So this is the classic. Yeah, I've got 3 credit cards. I'm paying a high interest rate on all of them, and yet for some people, or in fact most people, there will be some exceptions, but for most people, even today, they could probably go and consolidate that debt interest free for a period of time into another credit card deal. So that might give them that breathing space. But again, a lot of people don't do it because they don't understand that it's available. They don't understand how to do it. So I think when we talk about debt, there is that spectrum there, and actually understanding where you are on that spectrum will result in slightly different actions that you could take.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. We've got a couple of questions coming in actually on the same sort of lines. So I'll go to both of those. Both relate to the over 50s actually. So the first question is, how can you engage the over 50s if they don't speak to an advisor? The second one alludes to some research which came out, I think, today, looking at the proportion of advised decumulation sales, which has dropped sharply over the past 5 years. So I think both are sort of questions pointing towards the sort of, you know, how do we specifically engage that age group? And I think, Jonathan, your research itself found that sort of increasingly people approaching pension age, or of the age where they could, were increasingly dipping into their pension savings to sort of help with cost of living crisis as well. So all around that age group. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think that so the research did suggest that people were going to. Now, of course, these are the people that can access the pension, so 55 and over, and they're accessing it to supplement their income, primarily because of cost of living, and clearly that has knock-on effects. I mean, clearly, if you're accessing your pension early, it has a knock-on effect in terms of the pot, because clearly you're taking money out of that. Therefore, when you do eventually retire, you might need to extend the date at which you are going to retire compared to maybe what you originally thought, if you want to retire on an income that you had originally envisaged. So clearly, even when people are accessing, and they may have good reason, there may be a short-term need to access that money, then they need to understand the implications of it. Of course, there might also be short-term tax implications, because they might be a basic rate taxpayer, but because they're taking some money out of their pension, all of a sudden they become a high rate taxpayer for that financial year. So even things like that, it's important that they understand it, because it could be that, okay, they need a bit of additional money, but they take it what they need out in one go, whereas maybe actually it could straddle 2 tax years. So even those sorts of things, it's important for individuals to understand.
Kevin, anything to add to that, sort of engaging that sort of age group of people?
Longer term, I have a solution to this, which is not to give people this problem. And it really is, it's been called the hardest problem in finance, what to do to turn a pot of money into an income. It really is far too difficult. The answer is a CDC annuity, collective defined contribution annuity. But I have to accept, that may be a few years in the future, and we're not going to get rid of flexibility. So we've got to learn to live with it. I tend to look at, it's a bit like Jonathan's good debt and bad debt. I think there are good early withdrawals and bad early withdrawals. I think if somebody's only got £2,000 in their account because they only ever joined pensions under auto enrolment, they're relatively low paid, so it's never going to be a material part of their retirement savings because they're basically going to be relying on state benefits. I'm far more relaxed about those people accessing their pensions early. I think I get more concerned when you hear about people trying to access their pension savings where it will be a material part of their long-term income, because all they're doing is shifting a problem from one point in time to another. And I think we've got to keep doing all we can to educate people there, offer them flexibility, but offer them support and education and guidance so that they can make informed choices. I wouldn't want to stop people doing things, but I would want them to do it on an informed basis. You know, we've got transferring out of DB pots now has to be on an informed basis because of the way the legislation works there. Something perhaps not quite so heavy-handed, but something that suggests that individuals have considered the issues. Some sort of test that they have to pass might be a way of making sure that we have fewer bad outcomes for individuals.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it. Jonathan, how moving on to a slightly different topic, how often should you be looking to engage with sort of individuals to sort of push this message? Is this sort of financial education or once and done, a sort of midlife MOT, points in time type of things, or is it a process, a continuous sort of refresher and updating and sort of embedding this in as sort of a more continuous exercise?
Yeah, I mean, it's the latter. It needs to be continuous. A single intervention hopefully will be helpful to a point, but of course, as people progress through their careers and their situation changes and they have different decisions to make, then clearly they need to be up to speed on that. I think the other interesting thing about it being continuous goes back to the engagement point. So one of the things that we've found over the years is that when we've implemented a program for an organization, it almost reaches an optimal engagement point probably around 2 years in. And what I mean by that is that after about 2 years, because there would have been a lot of people that would have attended sessions on whatever subject it may be, because they tend to get so much out of it, they will actually go and tell their colleagues. And so normally by the time you're about 2 years into a program, it almost sells itself. I know that sounds like an amazing thing to say, but I say it's the ultimate in engagement. You know, a lot of people scratch their heads in our industry talking about engagement and how to do it. And actually one of the answers is that once you run these programs, you almost have automatic engagement after about 2 years, because you just have a critical mass of people that have been on various interventions, and as long as you're doing it well, they will tell colleagues, and then the thing will snowball and therefore maintain momentum.
Thank you, Kevin. Turning to you a little bit, a point of view, sort of in your experience as trustee, you talked a little bit about the bandwidth, but when is one of the challenges with bandwidth is sort of finding the right people to do this sort of program and provide this sort of service?
Yeah, absolutely. Once you've decided, I mean, I think life is a lot easier once you've decided that you do want to take the challenge of education and support and guidance out to people. There are plenty of providers out there. It's often struck me that one of the key things is around trust in all of this about engaging people and so forth. I keep coming back to the question of who do they trust? And it's easy to see that people have lost trust in just about everybody. Nobody trusts the government. No, everybody assumes financial providers will rip them off. And there's a sort of some embedded messages there that everybody's out to get me or something like that. I think we have a huge opportunity working through employers, because my feeling is they're probably one of the last bastions of people who are trusted. In other words, if the employer in a scheme decides to employ Jonathan, Jonathan comes then with a badge of approval by the trustees. I'm not seeing Jonathan as trying to do something which is bad for me. He's got a seal of approval. So I'm probably more likely to listen to him rather than assuming he's trying to con me into something else. I don't know. You must have that all the time, Jonathan, when you turn up in front of people.
Yeah,
What's in it for you? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point, and I think it goes back to this continuous program thing in a way as well. In that, if an organisation goes in and they don't deliver what's required, or they're trying to sell some other product or whatever it might be, then let's face it, that provider, let's call them, are not going to survive in that organisation for very long, because the trustees or the employer will turn around and go, look, we invited you in, but clearly it hasn't worked, and you're upsetting all our staff. So you need to sling your hook. So I mean that is always the acid test, I think, and I think that's why why the workplace is very, very important, because it can have that quality control, where it's very, very difficult for that to happen at an individual basis, because of course if an individual goes out to try and find an advisor, let's say, then okay, there are certain things that they can do to check qualifications and all the rest of it, but we know in reality most individuals do not do that. So often they might get a good advisor, they might get a bad advisor, but there's no real due diligence that's ever been done. Whereas of course if you're an employer or a scheme, you would have done that due diligence, and if it doesn't work out, you will get rid of that organization pretty quickly.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much. We're running out of time for this webinar, but I was just hoping to go to both Kevin and Jonathan, sort of final thoughts and key takeaways following our discussion there. Kevin, can I come to you first? Sort of, what's your sort of concluding thoughts?
I suppose I'd put a plea, as somebody who spent his life in pensions, I'd put a plea for thinking about life outside pensions. I think often we tend to approach some of these issues as if pensions was the only thing that mattered, whereas in reality there are plenty of other financial and non-financial issues that impact people. So it would always be to try and put things in a real world context and in a total context of the human beings that we're interacting with.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin and Jonathan.
Yeah, I echo that really. I think one of the key things here is making sure that members of these schemes really understand what their options are, because one of the things that I often say is that pensions for the individual, pension is just a cost for 40 years. It's just a cost to them, and there is no benefit. Maybe life insurance you could argue, but there's no real benefit. They only see the benefit 40 years down the road. So it's really important that people understand, they're helped through, if you like, all the issues that we've discussed on this session from the early years right up and until the point of retirement, that they're helped through that, because otherwise to them as an individual it is just a cost. So we need to be selling in the benefits and how we're going to optimize what they're in it for, which is at the end of the day how much income they're going to get in retirement.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Indeed, thank you, Kevin. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for this webinar. All that remains for me to do is to thank Jonathan Watsley and Kevin Wesbroom for taking part, and indeed for all of you for listening in. Please do join us for our next webinar soon. Thank you.